we need to have a conversation about Africa's potential. Why? Because we have been profiled negatively. The continent of disease, war, poverty. But we are stepping forward to say, look here, Africa is the continent with 60% of the world's renewable energy assets. Whether you talk about wind, whether you talk about solar, geothermal, hydropower. Number two, we're saying Africa is the continent that has 40% of the world's critical minerals for energy transition, whether you talk about nickel, cobalt, lithium, manganese. This is where those reserves are. Number three, this is the continent, the youngest continent with a median age of 19. 25% of the world's population will be living in this continent by 2050. We will have 40% of the world's workforce by 2100. This is the continent number 4 that has 2/3 of the world's uncultivated arable land that can transform through smart agriculture into the store, the production store of the world. And number 5, this is the continent that is the lungs of the world. We have the largest natural carbon sequestration infrastructure. In fact, we dare say, if there was a company for collecting garbage globally, and I'm talking about carbon garbage, Africa would have the largest shares because we have the largest lungs. The only problem is that those who produce the garbage refuse to pay their bills and profile the company as broke when it is actually them who have refused to pay the bills. So that is our continent. It's a continent of tremendous potential. And that is why Chinua Achebe told us that until the lion learned the art of writing, all stories glorified the hunter. I think we have learned to write. I think we have learned the art of writing. And that is why we are going to write our own narrative. That is the continent that we belong to. Let me also say another thing, opportunity. Yes, this climate crisis, climate change, and the climate crisis that comes with it, yes, it is true, we contributed the least. Yes, it is also true, we are suffering the most. But in this crisis is Africa's opportunity. And that is what we want to focus on. Africa's opportunity to unlock the tremendous resources that we have for green energy transition. And we must exploit this opportunity. And number 3, so that I conclude, is that this is the continent that has the highest investment potential. We are only limited by 2 things. Number 1, we are limited, as I said earlier in my statement, by high interest rates for development capital. Many of our countries, and we are here and they say figures don't lie, 9 countries are already in debt distress in our continent, over the cliff. 13 countries are classified as high risk, and another 17 countries are classified as moderate risk. And the biggest contributor to debt distress in our continent is high interest rates. We pay 5 times more than others, meaning that in fact, the architecture is set up in a manner that if you borrow, it will be difficult for you to pay. And that is why we need a conversation, and a very candid conversation, and we are saying this in all honesty, around how do we get concessional funding? How do we pay as much as others are paying? How do we get Africa away from paying 5 times more? And I asked in this gathering, we're not asking to be favored. We're not asking to be treated differently. We want a fair financial system that treats everybody equally. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not too much to ask. A fair international financial architecture is not a fair proposition or an unfair proposition to make. Number 2, many of our countries are headed into debt distress because of climate change. Let's be honest, we are suffering the most, whether it is in the Sahel with drought, whether it is in the Horn of Africa with drought, whether it is in South Africa and the southern part of our continent with cyclones, and we are saying the suffering is across the globe, but we carry the biggest brunt. I'll contextualize this. And because of climate change, we are forced to divert resources that are meant for economic growth into dealing with the effects of climate change. I will contextualize this. In Kenya, we lost 2.5 million heads of livestock in northern part of Kenya. Combined with Ethiopia and Somalia and Djibouti, we lost 9.5 million heads of livestock. So what did I have to do in Kenya? So in Kenya, I've had to increase resources meant for school feeding from 1.5 million children in school, under school feeding. We've had to scale up this year to 4 million kids in school to be put under school feeding, and we've had to rearrange the budget to provide for that. So when we say climate